My dear seekers of truth, I am Sigmund Freud, and today I must share with you perhaps the most critical discovery of my entire career in psychoanalysis, one that carries profound implications for your spiritual journey. There exists a sign, so subtle yet so destructive, that it can completely derail decades of spiritual work without you even realizing what is happening. This sign manifests when your unconscious mind, that vast repository of repressed memories and forbidden desires, begins to actively sabotage your conscious efforts toward enlightenment and spiritual growth. You have spent years, perhaps decades, seeking spiritual awakening. You have meditated for countless hours, attended workshops, read every sacred text you could find, yet something continues to elude you. There is a persistent feeling that despite all your efforts, you remain trapped behind an invisible barrier, unable to access the deeper spiritual states that others seem to achieve with ease. You blame yourself, thinking perhaps you lack discipline or faith, but the truth is far more complex and far more hopeful than you imagine. What I discovered through decades of analyzing the human psyche is that our unconscious mind operates according to its own logic, a logic that often directly conflicts with our conscious spiritual aspirations. The unconscious does not distinguish between spiritual growth and psychological threat. When you begin to approach genuine spiritual transformation, your unconscious may perceive this as a fundamental challenge to the psychological defenses it has spent a lifetime constructing. The result is what I call psycho-spiritual resistance, a phenomenon where your own mind becomes your greatest obstacle to the very thing you seek most desperately. Picture this scenario that I have observed countless times in my practice. You sit in meditation, genuinely committed to the process, yet your mind floods with distracting thoughts, bodily discomfort, or sudden urgent concerns about mundane matters. You assume this is simply the normal chatter of an untrained mind. But what if I told you that in many cases this is your unconscious mind, deliberately creating interference to prevent you from accessing deeper levels of consciousness that it perceives as threatening to your psychological stability? This is not a failure on your part, but rather evidence of a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism at work. The most dangerous sign I want to warn you about today manifests in a very specific way. It appears when you experience what seems like spiritual progress, followed by an inexplicable period of regression, self-sabotage, or the sudden emergence of old destructive patterns just when you thought you had overcome them. This is not random bad luck or spiritual weakness. This is your unconscious mind actively working to maintain what psychoanalysts call psychological homeostasis, the tendency of the psyche to return to familiar patterns even when those patterns are harmful. Before I continue, I must ask you something vital. Have you ever felt that despite all your spiritual practices, there remains a part of you that feels fundamentally unchanged, almost as if you are performing spiritual activities while a deeper part of your being remains untouched by the work? I want you to pause this video right now and reflect on this question honestly. The answer will determine how deeply you can benefit from what I am about to share with you. Now let me explain why traditional spiritual approaches, while valuable, often fail to address this unconscious resistance effectively. Most spiritual teachings focus on the cultivation of positive states, the transcendence of ego, and the development of higher consciousness. These are noble goals, but they often overlook the fundamental principle that you cannot transcend what you have not first understood and integrated. The unconscious mind contains not only your repressed traumas and forbidden desires, but also the adaptive mechanisms your psyche developed to protect you from psychological annihilation during your most vulnerable years. When you were a child, your developing psyche created elaborate defense mechanisms to help you survive in what may have been an emotionally threatening environment. These defenses served you well then, allowing you to maintain some sense of safety and coherence in the face of overwhelming experiences. However, what protected you as a child now imprisons you as an adult seeking spiritual liberation. The unconscious mind, operating with the logic of a frightened child, continues to activate these defenses whenever it perceives that your spiritual growth might threaten the psychological structure it has worked so hard to maintain. The dangerous sign I am warning you about manifests in several distinct ways, and recognizing these patterns is crucial for your spiritual development. First, you may notice that whenever you begin to experience genuine spiritual breakthroughs, you suddenly find yourself engaging in behaviors that you thought you had overcome. Perhaps you return to addictive patterns, fall into destructive relationships, or experience overwhelming anxiety and depression. Your conscious mind may interpret this as spiritual failure, but your unconscious mind is actually demonstrating its power to maintain psychological control. Second, you may experience what I call mystical inflation followed by devastating deflation. In these cycles, you achieve temporary states of expanded consciousness or profound spiritual insight, only to find yourself crashed back into ordinary consciousness with a vengeance, often feeling more disconnected from the spiritual realm than before you began your practice. This is not evidence that your spiritual experiences were false, but rather proof that your unconscious mind perceived these expansions as threats to its carefully maintained psychological territory. Third, and perhaps most subtly, you may find that your spiritual practice becomes increasingly compulsive and rigid rather than flowing and natural. When the unconscious mind cannot prevent spiritual activity altogether, it may co-opt that activity, transforming authentic spiritual practice into another form of psychological defense. Your meditation becomes a way to avoid feeling rather than to feel more deeply. Your spiritual study becomes intellectual accumulation rather than lived wisdom. Your service to others becomes a way to maintain a spiritual identity rather than an expression of genuine compassion. These patterns are not spiritual failures but psychological communications from your unconscious mind. They are attempts by the deeper layers of your psyche to tell you that something needs attention, understanding and integration before you can proceed safely on your spiritual path. Ignoring these signals or trying to override them through increased spiritual effort often leads to what I call the spiritual bypassing syndrome, where you appear to be making spiritual progress, while your fundamental psychological structure remains unchanged. I want you to pause here for a moment and consider your own spiritual journey. Think about the times when you felt closest to a breakthrough, and then ask yourself what happened next. Did you experience unexpected obstacles, sudden returns to old patterns, or inexplicable resistance to continuing your practice? If so, I want you to leave a comment below, sharing just one word that describes how this pattern has affected your spiritual journey. Perhaps that word is frustration, confusion, doubt, or determination. Whatever word comes to mind, share it in the comments. This simple act of naming your experience creates what psychoanalysts call conscious recognition, the first step in transforming unconscious patterns into conscious choice. When you share your experience in the comments, you are not only helping yourself by bringing awareness to these patterns, but you are also creating a therapeutic community where others can recognize that they are not alone in facing these challenges. Throughout my career, I have observed that the moment an individual realizes their struggles are part of a universal human pattern rather than evidence of personal failure, a profound shift occurs in their capacity for healing and growth. Your comment becomes a gift both to yourself and to others who are walking this same difficult but ultimately rewarding path of psycho-spiritual integration. Now let me continue by explaining the deeper dynamics at work when your unconscious mind perceives spiritual growth as a threat. The unconscious operates according to what I call the pleasure principle, always seeking immediate gratification and the avoidance of pain, while the spiritual path often requires us to face uncomfortable truths and postpone immediate gratification for long-term growth. This creates an inherent conflict that must be resolved through understanding and integration rather than force or spiritual willpower. The unconscious mind also contains what I have termed the death drive, a fundamental force that seeks to return to a state of non-existence or at least non-consciousness. When your spiritual practice begins to dissolve the ego structures that the unconscious mind equates with your very survival, this death drive may become activated, creating powerful resistance to continued spiritual development. This is why many seekers report that the closer they come to significant spiritual breakthroughs, the more intense their psychological resistance becomes. Furthermore, your unconscious mind contains imprints of every significant relationship you have ever had, beginning with your earliest caregivers. If your primary attachments were characterized by abandonment, betrayal, or emotional inconsistency, your unconscious may associate the dissolution of ego boundaries that occurs in deep spiritual states with the terror of abandonment or annihilation that you experienced in those early relationships. This is not a conscious fear, but an unconscious association that can trigger powerful defensive reactions whenever you approach states of spiritual surrender or unity consciousness. Consider the case of a woman I treated who had spent 15 years in dedicated spiritual practice yet found herself unable to sustain any progress beyond a certain point. Each time she began to experience what she called divine connection, she would inexplicably find herself engaged in destructive behavior that would pull her back to a familiar but painful emotional baseline. Through our analytic work together, we discovered that in her early childhood, moments of joy and connection with her mother were consistently followed by her mother's withdrawal and emotional abandonment. Her unconscious mind had learned to associate expanded positive states with impending loss, and it was actively sabotaging her spiritual experiences to protect her from the anticipated pain of spiritual abandonment. This case illustrates a crucial principle that most spiritual teachings fail to address adequately. Your capacity for sustained spiritual development is directly related to your unconscious sense of safety in expanded states of consciousness. If your early experiences taught you that vulnerability leads to pain, that opening your heart results in betrayal, or that transcending ordinary consciousness is dangerous, your unconscious mind will continue to activate protective mechanisms whenever your spiritual practice begins to access these vulnerable territories. The symptoms of unconscious spiritual resistance can be subtle and easily misinterpreted. You may experience chronic fatigue just before meditation retreats, sudden illness when approaching spiritual milestones, or the emergence of relationship conflicts whenever your practice begins to deepen. You might find yourself becoming increasingly critical of your spiritual teachers or community just as you begin to make progress, or you may experience what seems like spiritual emergency or dark night of the soul symptoms that pull you back from continued growth. Physical symptoms are particularly common and often overlooked as manifestations of unconscious resistance. The body, in psychoanalytic understanding, is the stage upon which unconscious conflicts are played out. You may experience chronic pain that has no clear medical cause but consistently interferes with your spiritual practice. You might develop digestive issues, sleep disturbances, or chronic anxiety that seems to worsen rather than improve with increased spiritual activity. These somatic symptoms are often your unconscious mind's way of communicating that something in your spiritual approach needs to be modified to accommodate deeper psychological needs. Modern neuroscience research has validated many of these psychoanalytic insights about unconscious resistance to change. Studies have shown that the brain's default network, which maintains our sense of self and personal narrative, becomes highly active when we attempt to access transcendent states through meditation or spiritual practice. This is not a design flaw but an adaptive mechanism that has helped humans maintain psychological coherence for millennia. However, understanding this mechanism allows us to work with it rather than against it. The key to resolving unconscious spiritual resistance lies not in overcoming or suppressing these defensive mechanisms but in understanding and integrating them into your spiritual practice. This requires what I call a psychoanalytically informed spiritual approach, one that honors both your conscious spiritual aspirations and your unconscious psychological needs. Such an approach recognizes that genuine spiritual development must include the healing and integration of your entire psychological structure, not just the cultivation of transcendent states. The first principle of this integrated approach is the development of what I call conscious witnessing of unconscious patterns. This means learning to observe your resistance without judgment, to notice when your unconscious defenses become activated, and to respond to these activations with curiosity rather than force. When you notice yourself sabotaging your spiritual practice, instead of berating yourself or trying to push through the resistance, you learn to ask what this pattern might be trying to protect you from or communicate to you. The second principle involves the systematic exploration of your personal psychological history, to identify the specific unconscious associations that may be triggering spiritual resistance. This is not about blaming your parents or dwelling in past trauma, but about understanding how your early experiences have shaped your unconscious expectations about vulnerability, surrender, and expanded consciousness. Through this understanding, you can begin to provide your unconscious mind with the safety and reassurance it needs to allow deeper spiritual opening. The third principle requires the development of what I call transitional practices that bridge the gap between your psychological needs and your spiritual aspirations. These might include forms of meditation that emphasize safety and grounding rather than transcendence, spiritual practices that honor your personal boundaries while gradually expanding them, or contemplative approaches that integrate psychological insight with spiritual wisdom. The goal is not to abandon traditional spiritual practices but to adapt them in ways that work with your unique psychological constitution rather than against it. The fourth principle involves recognizing that your psychological defenses, while they may currently limit your spiritual growth, contain important wisdom about your fundamental needs for safety, connection, and authenticity. Rather than viewing these defenses as obstacles to overcome, you learn to see them as allies that can inform and guide your spiritual development. Your anxiety about spiritual surrender may be protecting you from premature dissolution of necessary ego functions. Your tendency towards spiritual bypassing may be your psyche's way of telling you that you need more grounding before you can safely explore transcendent territories. Throughout my decades of analyzing the human psyche, I have observed that the individuals who achieve the most profound and sustainable spiritual development are those who learn to honor both their conscious spiritual goals and their unconscious psychological wisdom. They understand that authentic spiritual growth requires not the elimination of the ego or the transcendence of human psychology, but the integration of all aspects of their being into a more complex and mature spiritual identity. This integration process is not always comfortable or straightforward. It requires you to face aspects of yourself that you may prefer to ignore, to acknowledge needs and fears that seem incompatible with your spiritual aspirations, and to develop a more nuanced understanding of what genuine spiritual maturity actually entails. However, the rewards of this approach far exceed the temporary discomfort of honest self-examination. When you begin to work with your unconscious resistance rather than against it, you may notice that your spiritual practice becomes more sustainable and authentic. Instead of cycling through periods of intense practice followed by inevitable burnout or rebellion, you develop a steady rhythm of growth that honors both your need for spiritual development and your psychological requirement for safety and integration. Your spiritual insights begin to translate into genuine personality change rather than remaining isolated peak experiences that have little impact on your daily life. You may also discover that addressing unconscious spiritual resistance opens doors to forms of spiritual experience that were previously inaccessible. When your unconscious mind feels safe and included in your spiritual journey rather than threatened by it, it may actually become an ally in your development, providing access to intuitive wisdom, creative inspiration, and forms of knowing that transcend ordinary rational consciousness. The very psychological material that once seemed like an obstacle to spiritual growth becomes a source of depth, authenticity, and sustainable wisdom. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration today, I want to emphasize that recognizing and working with unconscious spiritual resistance is not a quick fix or a simple technique that can be mastered in a few sessions. It is an ongoing process of developing greater consciousness about the complex interplay between your psychological and spiritual nature. This process requires patience, compassion for yourself, and often the support of others who understand both psychological and spiritual development. If you have recognized yourself in the patterns I have described today, please know that this recognition itself is a significant step toward resolution. The unconscious can only maintain its sabotaging power as long as its operations remain unconscious. The moment you begin to see these patterns clearly, you have already begun to transform your relationship to them. You are no longer at the mercy of unconscious forces but can begin to engage with them as conscious choice points in your spiritual development. I encourage you to approach this work with the same dedication you have brought to your spiritual practice, understanding that psychological insight and spiritual wisdom are not competing approaches but complementary aspects of a complete human development. Your willingness to explore the depths of your own psyche with honesty and courage is itself a profoundly spiritual act, one that honors the full complexity and beauty of human consciousness. We'll remember that every great spiritual tradition, when examined closely, contains elements of what we would now recognize as psychological wisdom. The Buddhist understanding of the ego, the Christian emphasis on confession and forgiveness, the Hindu concept of samskaras or psychological imprints, and the mystical tradition's recognition of the dark night of the soul all point toward the necessity of integrating psychological and spiritual understanding for complete human development. Your spiritual journey is not separate from your psychological journey, but is the fullest expression of it. When you learn to honor both your conscious spiritual aspirations and your unconscious psychological wisdom, you embark upon a path of development that is both more challenging and more rewarding than either purely psychological or purely spiritual approaches can offer alone. The dangerous sign I warned you about at the beginning of our conversation, that subtle sabotage of your spiritual progress by your own unconscious mind, need no longer remain a mystery or an obstacle. It can become a teacher, guiding you toward a more complete and sustainable form of spiritual development. The very resistance that once seemed to block your path can become the doorway to a deeper, more authentic, and more lasting transformation. I want to close today by acknowledging the courage it takes to embark upon this journey of psycho-spiritual integration. You are not choosing the easy path, but you are choosing the path that leads to genuine freedom and authentic wisdom. Your willingness to examine both the light and shadow aspects of your nature, to honor both your spiritual yearnings and your psychological needs, places you among those rare individuals who are committed to the full realization of human potential. If what I have shared with you today resonates with your experience, I invite you to join our community of conscious seekers by subscribing to this channel and engaging with others who are walking this path of integrated development. Together, we are exploring territory that mainstream spiritual and psychological communities often avoid, the complex intersection where genuine spiritual development meets deep psychological understanding. Your participation in this community, whether through subscribing, commenting, or sharing your insights, contributes to the collective wisdom we are building together. Please remember to like this video if you found it valuable, as this helps others who may be struggling with similar patterns to discover this perspective. The algorithms that govern these platforms respond to engagement, and your simple action of clicking the like button may be the difference between someone else finding the understanding they desperately need or remaining trapped in cycles of unconscious spiritual self-sabotage. Your journey toward integrated spiritual development is not a solitary endeavor but part of a larger movement toward more complete and authentic human flourishing. Every step you take toward greater consciousness, every moment of honest self-examination, every act of courage in facing your psychological depths contributes not only to your own liberation, but to the collective evolution of human consciousness itself. This is both the greatest challenge and the greatest gift of being human in this remarkable time of unprecedented access to both psychological and spiritual wisdom. Take your time with this material, allow it to work within you at whatever pace feels sustainable and safe. Trust your own inner wisdom to guide you toward the specific practices and insights that will serve your unique path of development. And remember always that the goal is not perfection but integration, not the elimination of human psychology but its conscious embrace and transformation in service of your deepest spiritual aspirations.